can feel my body hold against the concrete, but I can't seem to get enough. My mind is fixed on what it wants. I just let you beat me, look at me deceiving. Let you get the best of me, in bed with my worst enemy. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone, back up and get me home. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone, back up and get me home. So put your hand in mine, follow me, let me waste your time. Set up feet, do some stupid shit. Take a seat, let me waste your time.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Lawyer's Den. My name is Nick Pallavita. I'll be your moderator for today's show. And today we have a very exciting topic and a new person who's entered the den. We'll have him introduce himself later on. But this topic involves something that's going on right now in the United States of America. Can a USA president impound funds? And this is for our worldwide audience because they follow what happens in American politics. And we're seeing a lot of executive orders and fund impoundment. And that involves two clauses that we're going to look at, and I'm sure the Supreme Court is going to look at sooner or later. One is this one, Article 1, where Congress is granted the power to pay the debts and provide for the general welfare. But then we have another article, which is Section 1 of Article 2, where the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. So the question is, on this impoundment, who wins? Well, we're going to bring in our panel, and we have Adam Lamparero, who's a professor at Georgia College, who will be giving us some constitutional background. We have Peter Bennett from the greater New York City area, and we have our new den master, Sean Jameson, who's with Purdue Global University. And we're going to start with Peter Bennett, because he's always prepared, as to see what he thinks. Because remember, this is going on right now in the United States. Funds are being impounded by President Trump. Can he do so? So, Peter, take it away.
So I always start with the background, and I save my legal arguments for later. So a power struggle concerning government spending has been heating up in Washington, D.C., igniting what some Senate Democrats call a constitutional crisis amid the Trump administration's efforts to curb government waste. The point of contention is, the topic of this discussion, the Impoundment Control Act. It's a 1974 law which Trump and his new OMB officer both argue is unconstitutional, and the act itself reasserts Congress's power of the purse and bars the executive branch from unilaterally sidestepping Congress and withholding appropriation funds. Some legal experts warn that the matter is not up for debate, and we'll be debating it, probably. And the courts are clear it is unconstitutional, and that's what they're arguing, for the executive branch to divert dollars Congress has authorized. What is the Impoundment Act? The U.S. Constitution granted Congress the authority to manage the federal budget, to determine funding decisions, to balance power between the branches. We all know, each of the branches has their roles. However, the act of impoundment occurs when the executive branch chooses to not spend those approved dollars from Congress, since the executive branch is the overseers of the actual spending of the approved funds. Should a president want to spend less than what Congress has budgeted, the executive branch must secure approval from Congress. Deferring funds also requires that inform information to Congress. As a result, Congress passed the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, subject of this discussion, to establish proper channels of congressional oversight if a president chooses to withhold or defer funds. So that's the background, and we'll take it away with the debates.
Okay, opening statements from Adam Lamparero. You're up.
Yeah, so I think there's a few issues that need to be considered here. Number one, Trump is trying to impound funds in part for the purpose of eliminating waste and abuse. So typically, or ordinarily, Congress allocates the funds, and the president is responsible, and the executive branch is responsible for enforcing that. So traditionally, the president does not have the power to impound funds. The question is, however, if he is identifying areas of waste and abuse, that constitutes an impoundment. And the second thing pertains to administrative agencies, which are part of the executive branch. The question there is, if Congress enacts an enabling statute that gives agencies the power to implement legislation and adopt particular rules, and as part of that rulemaking process, that involves the expenditure of money, then it becomes more of a gray area about whether the president can impound those funds. So I think this is going to be an issue that will be decided by the Supreme Court, and right now its resolution is uncertain.
Okay, we're going to bring in Sean. You're up now to bat. What do you think about the impoundment of funds?
Thank you. Yeah, well, so there is a process for the president that would be constitutional, would not require this confrontation, but we all make our choices, right? So I think as it was set up at the beginning, there is an Impoundment Act, and there is a way to inform Congress and have Congress either accept what the president wants to do, or to just ignore it for 45 days and then the money is distributed. So if there is fraud and abuse, that actually is a really easy thing to do. You put it before Congress, and they'll be so embarrassed that they'll agree, and then the money won't be spent. So that's my first take on it.
Right. Okay, and now we're going to go to Jeff Teichert. Jeff has just arrived, so we're going to have him up.
Thanks, Nick. The impoundment of money is kind of interesting because I think it presents a separation of powers issue for the president and Congress. Typically, as you know, Congress has the power of the purse. They have all the money. The president has all the guns. He has the enforcement power. Now, in early medieval England, before the 13th century, kings typically raised revenue primarily through feudal dues, rents, and things like that. They exacted military service for people's tenure and land. But as in the 13th through 16th and even 17th centuries, Parliament began exerting more influence over taxation, and they exerted specific control on how the money could be appropriated and spent. That came to a head during the revolutions of the 17th century, and Parliament started to flex its muscles a little more. In the time of James I and Charles I, there was a civil war over ways that he was raising money. Taxation without representation would be a familiar theme that we in America could relate to. But it was also about how the money was spent. Charles took money that had been appropriated by Parliament to help defend the nation and sort of repurposed it to creating a lavish court life for himself and his family. And that irked a lot of people in Parliament. I could go on and on with this sort of history. The point is, down to the question of can the executive impound money and refuse to spend money appropriated by Congress? I don't think they can. I always thought when Trump was impeached the first time that they really got the wrong issue. I remember he had taken money appropriated for the Defense Department and used it to build the border wall. I'm for the wall. I like the wall. But I think that it was unconstitutional. Excuse me.
Okay.
Take that money and come back to me.
Okay, we'll go to Peter. What is your thoughts on this? This is going in front of Supreme Court.
Legal arguments, but here's an interesting non-legal argument, but I wanted to bring this out, so I will. Ulysses Grant had a really interesting philosophy. I have many philosophies of life, and it's one of mine, but it has to be balanced with others. But his philosophy of war, and he was considered obviously a great general, was basically go full guns. It was basically attack, and then if things don't go well, reverse course. So just go for it and reverse. And from, again, a more of a background perspective, it's definitely how Trump is and the administration is approaching things now, because they are just going. They are not following procedures and not worrying about it right now, and they're all over the place, which I'm sure upsets some people. But the other side of that is, and I brought this up in the last show, and the United States is in really bad shape. We have, according to David Walker, who was the Comptroller General, 125 trillion in debt. Every day you see everybody concerned about the 36 trillion. But what they're not talking about is all the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. So we're talking about huge, unfathomable amounts of money. 125 trillion is more money than the U.S. stock market, bond market, and all U.S. commercial real estate and all U.S. privately real estate. So this is a desperate time. And a footnote I always used to say on my finance show is every other country I've looked at in the world, in other countries in Asia and Europe and South America, are in almost exactly the same shape. They haven't put the money away for aging demographics. So because of the desperation, one could argue the law doesn't matter, even though this is a legal show. I wouldn't always say that, but that, the best approach is just attack. So, but I will add then my first legal argument, but I have something on the other side, but that is that even Russell, if I'm saying it right, Vogt, who is the OMB director now, he was just confirmed, he said it in his confirmation hearing that, quote, no court of law has found the Impoundment Control Act unconstitutional. So basically that act is probably constitutional, but again, there's probably wiggle room within the framework of the act.
Okay, we'll go to Adam. What are your thoughts on this? Is Trump going to win this or lose this?
It's possible. Well, by way of background, there's two ways under the Impoundment Control Act that you can withhold funds. The first is a deferral, in which you defer the time in which you're going to spend the money for a specific period. The second is rescission. That would require the president to go before the Appropriations Committee to request that those funds not be spent. Now, what Trump is doing here does not technically comport with the act. However, there are two important questions that are raised. If Congress appropriated this money, but a portion of that money is being wasted or spent in ways that Congress did not intend, then that raises an issue of whether Trump can cut out that excess and argue that it's not within the scope of what Congress authorized. The second thing, of course, is that, ultimately, what he can say is that he has the authority to do this because Congress often appropriates funds to agencies, and then agencies, which is not a democratic process, decide through rulemaking under the Administrative Procedures Act to allocate money in specific ways. He can argue that the agency's allocation of that money is within his purview as the head of the executive branch and seek to impound it that way. I think these are questions that have not been answered by the Supreme Court. But ultimately, what Trump's trying to do is say, look, I don't want to go to Congress and go through all this bureaucratic mess. We are facing bankruptcy as a country, and cutting waste, fraud, and abuse and curbing agency spending is something that the act did not contemplate, and that is within the purview of his executive authority. And I think that that's a question of first impression for the court. Okay, so it looks like we're going up in the Supreme Court. Jeff, what is your thoughts on this? Hopefully you can talk. You're muted, Jeff. You're muted.
Yeah, apologize for the earlier disruption and for being muted. In the later 17th century and in the 18th century, Queen Anne, for example, had some limited amount of royal discretion over the spending of Parliament, military spending and such. George III was politically active. He was a real ruler. He wasn't a figurehead like the King of England now, but he could not refuse appropriated money. And that was in the time of the American founding. The chief executive in England, the society we were familiar with and patterned our Constitution after, the chief executive couldn't refuse to spend money appropriated by Parliament. And by the end of his reign, financial control by Parliament was fully cemented. Now, I would suggest that if he couldn't refuse to spend appropriated money in that time, certainly an American president cannot. And Congress is the master of the purse strings, both in taxing and spending, and those are the fundamental powers of Congress. That is how it will exert control over the executive. It either cuts off funds or it appropriates money. And I had mentioned that I think they impeached Trump for the wrong thing the first time. He had taken money appropriated to the Defense Department and repurposed it to the border wall. And I think you can at least make the argument that he didn't stay within the purpose of the appropriation, particularly in view of the fact that Congress turned down that size appropriation during that same Congress when he just went ahead and spent the money from somewhere else. So again, I was for the wall. I liked the idea. I still like it, but I think it was that his transfer of the money to the wall from the Defense Department was unconstitutional.
Jeff, let me jump in there for 1 second before somebody else have a question, though. Couldn't it be argued that the wall was about the defense of the United States?
I mean, I think you can argue that. I think it is dubious given that Congress turned down that more specific appropriation for that. And I think also money appropriated to the Defense Department doesn't mean necessarily that the Secretary of Defense or the President even can just go wild with it and spend it on virtually anything. I think he took it from other specific appropriations and used it to build the wall. So
even though there were huge amounts of terrorists coming over the border, there was an issue of many, and I'd say past tense because the border's almost down to nothing. They're down to 195 catches per day now, and it was thousands, and it was out of control. But there was the argument not only that many known terrorists were slipping through, but also, and drugs, which I guess maybe you wouldn't argue that's defense, but also there were a huge amount of military-aged Chinese men coming across the border, and it may or may not pose a threat in the future or not, but it could be argued that they were a military threat to the United States.
Oh, I'm with you on that as a policy matter. I just I'm not with you as a constitutional matter. I think that the solution to that is have Congress appropriate the money and address the problem in a constitutionally appropriate way, rather having the president say, I'm going to do an end run around them. And I think the English Civil War, as well as the American Revolution, are examples of why you have to have separation of powers and you have to have Congress be given the power of the purse. Now, the president has certain checks on that. The veto power is one of those. But, frankly, I kind of like the idea that in the current deficit spending spree that's been going on, that why not let the president impound it and refuse to spend it and say, take it back and pay debt with it. I mean, I sort of like the idea. The problem I have is I think it's a fundamental transfer of legislative power to the executive. And I don't believe that solving a momentary crisis is worth eroding the separation of powers scheme that our Constitution rests on. And I think it is the most fundamental power of Congress is to tax and spend.
Well, let me just raise two quick issues. Number one, as a practical matter, if you look at some of the things that the Department of Government Efficiency has uncovered, they have uncovered nonsensical spending on ridiculous things that call into question whether Congress really appropriated it. But what they've also found is that contracts that were ended years ago, we're still paying individuals who are parties to those contracts, even though the contracts ended years ago, and we're still paying people who are dead. There is no way that Congress, when they allocated these funds, intended for that to happen. That raises me back to the question of waste and the not being within the scope of what Congress intended. And second, a lot of this money is coming from agency rulemaking, not from Congress. And agencies are part of the executive. So why should we be allowing undemocratic agencies, which are overseen by the executive, to spend money that Congress broadly allocated? I think that those raise serious constitutional issues. But I will say this: one thing that does not bode well for Trump is a case called Clinton versus New York and the Line Item Veto Act, which the court in a 6-3 decision ruled unconstitutional, prohibiting the president from striking certain portions of spending bills. Now, that's only an analogy, but I do think that might be relevant. But ultimately, I wonder if the issue is going to be, what did Congress really intend these funds to be spent for? And if it's not within that scope, particularly if it involves agencies' allocation of money, whether that changes the equation.
Okay. Sean, comments?
Yeah, I was gonna talk about Clinton, but you beat me to it. So, but yeah, some governors have that power, and it's an interesting power, and it can be very helpful, I think. But I think the intent is for a package to go through, and I think that the theory is right that we all get a little bit of something we want and some things we don't want, and we have to agree. And that's kind of how the government works. But I think to the specific point, and I wish I knew more about other areas beyond the Impoundment Act, but if you actually have fraud, I believe there are other remedies, right? When we do a big recovery from whatever it is, the savings and loan crisis or whatever, hurricane just happened to hit. When there's fraud, we can recover, right? We don't need the president to impound that money. We can go after the people that committed the fraud. So I think there are other remedies for that other than impounding money. And I think too, it's important to look at the categories of what we're stopping payment on. Are these nonprofits that have done the work that they contracted for and now they're billing and they're expecting payment and they're going to go under if they don't get it? Are they farmers that did the conservation work that they promised and now they're not being paid? And what does that do to the reputation of the government, and what does it do to the people who relied on the government for those payments?
That's a good question. Yeah, Jeff.
If I could make a quick extension of what you said, I'm surprised that everyone, including me, hasn't made mention yet of the Graham-Redman Act back in the 1990s. Of course, it was named after its sponsors, Senators Phil Graham and Warren Redman, and what it essentially did is it allowed the comptroller of the currency to go in, and if the budget wasn't balanced or wasn't meeting certain targets moving toward balance, the comptroller could impound the funds and refuse to spend them. And even though Congress approved this act and it was signed by the president, as I understand it, the Supreme Court said, no, this puts an executive branch official in charge of government spending, taxing and spending, which is the legislative power, and you can't do it. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to find happens with attempts to impound money now.
I have actually, I'm going to go, my real solid legal argument, I think, is this. Here is the act itself. This is that applies to U.S. Code 688. And reading it, it leads to two things. One, it begins whenever the president determines that all or part of any budget authority will not be required to carry out the full objectives or scope of the programs for which it is provided, or such budget authority should be rescinded for fiscal policy, he's required to notify Congress. And that notification, just to specify without reading the whole thing, he's supposed to tell Congress the amount of the budget authority rescinded, the specific projects, the reasons why it's rescinded, and also all the facts and circumstances. So here's my two conclusions. Number one, you can argue very strongly that if he takes something that is, if this is Avenue One, he takes some budget authority for X purpose, and he then applies it to another purpose within that budget authority. In other words, if he says it's supposed to be spent for this, and he spends it in a different way for the same purpose, then that budget authority has not changed. It's just his execution, and he is in charge of execution. The other thing that the actual act leads to is the fact that the executive could remedy this very easy, as I think Sean said before. He could have sent out an easy to comply with notice to Congress, which is very unlikely to overrule him given the waste and fraud. Or he could do that today at least to remedy this. So if I was him, the first thing I would do is create that message and send it out, because the days are running by and he's out of compliance. Then he's in compliance with the U.S. Act. So you could argue about the budget authority avenue and also about being in compliance with the act by just sending out the notice.
Yeah, I think, Peter, that's kind of raises the question that people have when people are, the pearl clutching and saying there's a constitutional crisis. Maybe they're onto something, because I have to think that they know that remedy is available and they're choosing not to use it because they want the showdown and they want to expand the power of the executive, which, you can agree or disagree with that, but, assuming that power changes, does the party in power actually want an executive from the other party to have all these powers that are now being expanded?
My guess is different, Sean. My guess is, and this is just guessing, we don't know what's going on in the White House. My guess is Trump is Grant. I mean, he will go after what he wants aggressively and quickly and often get it and often succeed. My guess is it's just sloppiness. Another example would be last week's discussion about Elon Musk and the fact that if Trump had signed Elon Musk's orders, there would have been no issue at all. And as a matter of fact, they did resend it out since then. And they had the agencies sign the exact same thing, saying, you need to email us and tell us your 5 purposes. And just by having the agents, the heads of the agency sign it, it remedied it. So, I mean, look, Trump he's a business person. He's not a politician. He probably is unfamiliar with a lot of these procedures. And he's more of a charge ahead and we need to get this done guy. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if next week they send notice to Congress, just like they remedied last week's discussion, in which we said a simple notice from, if Trump had signed the same thing, it would have been unchallengeable. So hopefully this week he'll watch our show and he'll do the same thing, right, Nick?
Yeah, well, sometimes notice requirements work and you sidestep the constitutional issues. But I did find Jeff's argument interesting, is what they call repositioning funds. Like they use Defense Department money to build the wall. But remember, our interstate system of the United States was built on Defense Department funds. So the thing is, the real question is to what extent he can reposition the funds in other places or just impound it, because the article says that it gets power to pay the debts, which is paid for, provide for the general welfare. So they provided for the general welfare, but then say to what extent you have to provide for the general welfare. But I think you might find a constitutional showdown if he doesn't send the notice requirement out using the executive's language, which says the power shall be vested in President of the United States. Is he really an executive, or is he just a teetotaler for Congress? In other words, he's just an administrator for Congress. So I think it's really going to be up to the Supreme Court to see whether or not he is a true executive, which means that he has the power that's vested in him, or is he just an administrator for Congress? So this issue hasn't been addressed in quite some time, and I think you're going to find a showdown, especially with the Donald. I mean, there's nothing else he's going to do. But what we're going to do is not going to show down. We're going to sign off because we're at the half of the hour, and we are beaming, I believe, onto TikTok now for the first time. So this will be our first show on TikTok. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. We have our own Roku channel. You can view us there, Amazon Fire, and want to thank our viewers in the United States and also around the world for watching Lawyers Den. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
I can feel my body hold against the concrete, but I can't seem to get enough. My mind is fixed on what it wants. I just let you beat me, look at me deceiving, let you get the best of me, in bed with my worst enemy. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone, back up and get me home. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone.